Sins of a Solar Empire 2 is almost here and brings all of the huge-scale, real-time, space-based warfare you could ask for. But a game so complex can be pretty intimidating, so I'm here to give you a complete beginner's guide to get you from 0 hours of playtime in the series to a victory in no time. And thanks to Stardock for sponsoring this video. Sins is available on Steam in just a few days, so check it out at the link in the description. So first of all, let's go through the game setup and faction select. When you're setting up your game, there's a number of options you can tweak that will affect how the entirety of the rest of that game will play out. Of course, you can choose which map you'd like to play on, and this will dictate how many planets, stars, and players will be in the game, as well as the general layout of the map. When first starting out, I'd recommend starting on a 2-player map to avoid fighting a war on too many fronts at once, and working your way up from there. Once you've selected a map, you can pick your faction. There are 3 factions to choose from, and each one has 2 variants, which shake things up whilst keeping the same base, like most of the unit's roster, and faction-specific mechanics. I'll create some guides for these in future, but each one is powerful in their own way, and you're not going to be at much of a disadvantage by picking whichever you fancy. If I was to give a suggestion, I would say either of the tech factions are probably the simplest to use. You can also choose your opponent's faction and difficulty, and I'd always recommend starting on easy or below and working your way up from there. There's a lot to get to grips with in this game, so giving yourself some leeway whilst learning is absolutely the way to go. Aside from factions, we can also change some game-specific settings. Orbiting planets are a new feature in Sins 2. This means all planets in the game will orbit the star, changing the map over the course of the game. This can open up new lanes between planets and send a planet once on your doorstep to the other side of the system. It can be a little overwhelming trying to plan around this early on, so feel free to turn it off whilst learning. But don't be afraid to give it a try later, as it really does change the game and affect your decision making. The home planet victory is a victory condition where players lose if they lose their home world they start the game with. With this enabled, you are not able to change your home planet, and if it gets taken, it's game over. This allows for much faster ending games rather than having to totally eradicate your enemies from the galaxy. It makes it a lot easier to get a win when you're first starting out, so by all means, turn this on. You just might want to keep it turned off later when you want longer, more complex games. The colonization victory instead awards the victory to the player who's the first to colonize the majority of the galaxy. This is a much more achievable victory condition, only requiring you to take enough territory to get the win, rather than wiping anyone out. In my opinion, either the home world or the good old-fashioned annihilation are the way to go for a longer and more satisfying game, but to each their own. The rest of the settings change how quickly certain things happen, essentially changing how long the game lasts. Game speed pretty much changes the default speed of the entire game, so the higher this is, the faster ships move, the quicker you gain resources. Basically, everything gets sped up, resulting in a faster game. Orbiting planet speed will only affect how fast planets move around the system, so it doesn't really affect game speed and is more a preference-based option. Everything else is fairly self-explanatory. The faster they are, the shorter the game is likely to be. With all this out of the way, we're ready to start the game. Once you load in, you're going to be met with a whole bunch of user interface. While it can be extremely overwhelming to get started, it's really not that complicated once you know what each part means. In the top left, we have the fleet/pinned planet menu. From here, you can see any fleets we have in our faction, as well as any planets we've pinned. This is essentially a quick access menu for you to manage the most important areas of your empire. Starting from the left, going along the top, first we have research menus. There are 2, one for infrastructure and one for military. Research of any kind needs research points, and these are earned via orbital structures and certain planetary items. Once you have some points, you can head into either of these menus and queue up your desired research projects. Projects are divided into 5 tiers, and each tier must be completed before any of the projects can be progressed. You can simply select a tech further down the tree, and provided you have the research points and resources necessary, everything will get queued up for completion along the bottom. Lastly, anything in this queue can be moved around, provided they're both researchable at the same time, allowing you to prioritize what you need. Diplomacy allows you to interact with other factions in the game once they've been discovered. Whilst I could talk about this later, in this game, it's extremely simple. Once discovered, you can offer various alliances to the other faction, from a simple ceasefire to a full-blown pact who share a whole bunch of benefits and can win the game together. To balance deals, you can offer or request any of the resources in-game and send away your offer for the consideration of the target. After a short wait, they'll get back to you with either a yes or a no, and boom, you've just done diplomacy. Normally, teams are created when setting up the game and rarely change, but if you're swimming in cash and want to pacify an enemy or group to take on a major threat, the option is there. Minor factions is where you interact with the minor factions discovered in the map. These occupy single planets, and by spending influence, you can improve your relationship with them for various rewards. You can also spend influence to discover them if you're struggling to locate them through exploration. While they can offer some nice bonuses, it's not something you absolutely need to make use of to win, so I wouldn't worry too hard about optimizing them when you're just getting started. Military Command shows you how much fleet supply you've used, as well as your max supply. And fleet supply is essentially the total amount of military ships you can field at any one time. You can also see a breakdown of what's consuming your supply, and clicking on this will show you a list of your capital ships and star bases, allowing you to build items for them without the need for individual clicking. Colonized planets shows you a list of your owned planets and their size, and clicking on this allows you to manage their civilian and military orbital structures, as well as any planetary items and upgrades. In the middle we have our 3 major resources. Credits are earned via our planets, metal and crystal are earned via planetary mining, and orbital miners. All 3 of these resources are spent on a wide range of things, from research to planet upgrades to ships. Markets allow you to buy and sell metals, crystals, and exotic materials once you've discovered their locations. This can be a great way to shift around your economy when you need one thing or have an excess of another. Be aware that the pricing of these markets changes with the supply and demand, so be careful when selling large quantities to ensure you're not wasting your resources. The next slot will change based on your faction as it houses their unique mechanics. This will be Trade for Tech, Unity for Advent, and Phase Resonance for the Vasari. The Exotics tab will show you how many of each exotic you own. These are rarer resources found from surveying planets and capturing certain orbital artifacts. They can also be crafted in orbital exotic refineries at the cost of the other 3 resources, and they are then spent on capital ships and titans. The clock speed shows the total game time, and hovering over it allows you to pause the game and change the speed. And this can also be done with spacebar and the plus and minus keys on your keyboard, and comes in useful during both the more hectic and slower periods of the game. Future Orbits shows you what will happen to all visible planets during the next hour of gameplay. This is only available if orbital planets are enabled, and can be very useful when planning your expansion so you know which planets are worth taking for a future advantage. Lastly, up here you can hide the UI if you want to get all cinematic, or open the menu. In the upper right you have a summary of everything in the gravity well you're currently looking at. You have the name and size of the planet, any orbital structures, as well as any ships, and everything here is color coded so you can tell what faction it belongs to. Lastly, if you select basically anything, you'll get a menu along the bottom of the screen, but I'll cover these in more detail in the different sections of gameplay. With all that out of the way, we can finally get into how to start your games. Whilst every game will have a different set of circumstances depending on the map and number of factions in play, there are some general tips you can follow to set yourself up for success later on. First of all, you'll need to build your first fleet. Whilst you can do this from planet menus, I'd always advise using the fleet menu at all times. It gives you a lot more control over what's going into your fleet and makes it a lot easier to stay organized. Plus, if you request ships from here, they'll rally to the rest of the fleet automatically, saving you ordering them to group up. To start off with, you'll normally only have the option of a single offensive frigate and a choice of capital ships. I would advise you find the capital ship which has the colonized ability and choose that as your first ship every single time. This will save you also having to build a colony ship and have it follow around your army, waiting for the all clear. This way you can send the capital ship around and it'll be able to take on most early game threats, no problem, and take planets as it goes. The first capital ship should be free and spawn in instantly. Just be sure to level up the colonize ability and you're off to the races. I'd advise adding around 10 frigates to your fleet with your capital ship, and this will probably max out your fleet supply for now. Whilst it can take on most early threats alone, this backup will allow it to move much faster and make rapid early expansion a lot easier. Once those are queued up, you can start sending the fleet out to expand your empire. You should also start the game with a couple of exploration ships, and they should have already started automatically exploring the map. If they've discovered a neighbouring planet that's colonizable already, send your fleet there as soon as you can. And don't worry about moving your fleet to any location in that gravity well in particular. As long as they get there, they'll automatically get to work doing what needs to be done. In every system, there'll be at least a handful of defending forces, but for the most part, they should be no match for your fleet. Once they're cleared out, your capital ship should automatically claim the planet, and you just rinse and repeat this, slowly building out your territory. As for how to decide where to expand, it all really depends on the map and how it will change if orbiting planets are enabled. You want to create a strong territory line where you can build defensive structures to keep enemies back whilst the economy is handled on the back lines. The last thing you want is leaving an opening into your lands that allows enemies to totally avoid all defenses. So, scope out how the system will change if orbiting is enabled, and plot out where you want to expand that will allow you to fulfill this criteria and set up strong choke points you can focus on defending. Outside of this, you can take basically all systems you come across at no real penalty to yourself aside from time spent. Certain planets like volcanics may not be colonizable right out the gate, so don't worry yourself with them right now, but just make sure to come back to them later once research is underway, since they will eventually be just as valuable as any other planet. As you're doing this, you'll want to be building up each of your planets, and that brings us to planetary management. I should specify that when I call it planetary management, I'm really talking about the entire gravity well, including the planet and any orbital structures, but for simplicity's sake, let's just put everything under that planet umbrella, since without that, you can't do any of this. Every planet can be developed in a large number of ways, and these are all shown when you select one on the menu along the bottom of the screen. The survey option searches the planet and has the chance to produce exotics. This is a great way to gain some early on, but you don't really have to worry about it until later when you're trying to build more capital ships and have some more income at your disposal. Each planet also has a number of slots for planet items, and these come in 3 flavors. Economy improves all income, so credits, metal or crystals. Defense makes the planet harder to take in a number of ways, and support houses everything else like research, influence, and other miscellaneous upgrades. To start out with, I'd aim to get a research item built in your homeworld as soon as you can. These normally grant more research points than they do on any other planet, so are a great early investment to get yourself started in research. Outside of that, what to build on each planet comes down to good old-fashioned, it depends. Thankfully, it's a depends that depends on something actually measurable. For example, if you have a volcanic world, they can only mine metal, so an economy item that improves your output of metal would be a great choice to push this even further. If you have a choke point stronghold planet, then defensive items that make it tougher or buff the abilities of your defenses and ships would be a great idea to make it even harder to crack. You basically have to look for what the planet is really good at or has the potential to be really good at, and find the items that make it even better at that job. Of course, not every planet will only be good at one thing, so just try and find what it does best and make it do it better. Once you've done that, you can consider options that make your empire better, so research items, something that interacts with culture, influence, or even your faction's unique mechanic. I wouldn't rush to fill these slots up right away early on, but once you're a ways into the game and have more resources coming in, circle back and fill them up to bring in more value. In the middle, you can hover over to see the credit, metals, and crystals income, and also the size of the planet, and this is just dictated by how many upgrades are completed on the right hand side of this UI. Speaking of which, over on the right, we have even more options for planet development. All of these options increase the health of the planet, as well as their own effects and the level as I just mentioned. This cog icon upgrades the planet's capacity for civilian orbital structures. These can be built from the orbitals menu just above this, and there are quite a few. Metal and crystal extractors allow you to mine resources from asteroids orbiting the planet. Factories allow you to build different unit types. Research stations increase your research points, and exotic refineries allow you to create exotics at the cost of other resources. The culture structures change name from faction to faction, but all do the same job of spreading your faction's culture to neighboring worlds. Culture has different effects depending on your faction, but generally, you want yours to be covering at least all of your own worlds and ideally be putting pressure on the worlds of other factions. It normally provides various bonuses to your planets and fleets, so it is worth putting some resources into and setting up early on. Civilian structures are very worth investing in, particularly once you can research orbital mining. That extra resource income will really help you take your total income to the next level and catapult your faction ahead. Other structures like research are great for increasing your points whenever you need to move up a research tier. And make sure you spread factories around your territory so your ships don't have to travel the full length of the map to reinforce fleets. The icon to the right of the cog upgrades this planet's defenses. This increases the number of orbital military slots. These can also be built from the same menu as civilians and contain everything you'd expect, like various stationary turrets, hangars to launch strike craft, various support structures, and your faction's starbase. Those choke point planets I mentioned earlier, where you want to hold enemies back from the rest of your land, they will be where you build most of your defensive structures, at least in the start. If you want to play smart and be prepared, then every system should have some level of defense, otherwise enemies will have an easy time taking you out completely if they make it past your front line. That said, in the early game when resources are tight, focus on those stronghold planets first and work your way backwards over time. The last three icons are much more simple to explain. Commerce allows you to upgrade the amount of credit income produced on the planet, mining increases the income of one or both of metal and crystals being produced on planets, and research improves the amount of research speed that planet provides. The final two icons on the top are shipbuilding, which I've already said to avoid and just use fleets, and strikecraft management, which you can pretty much ignore for as long as you play this game, unless you're really into min-maxing. It essentially allows you to choose how many bombers and fighters you want being housed in your hangars and starbases. Like I said, you can leave this as is most of the time, so really don't need to worry about it when you learn in the game. The final button opens the advanced options menu. From here you can assign the selected planet to be your homeworld as long as the homeworld victory condition is disabled. This comes with a lot of benefits for your target, but is very costly and obviously removes those benefits from your existing homeworld, so choose carefully. Rotate orbital structures allows you to move orbitals around your planets. This is useful if you need to move your military buildings close to the entrance into the system, especially if you have orbiting planets. They can very quickly end up out of place and out of range to do anything useful, so make sure they're in the right spot with this. Just a word of warning, structures in motion cannot do anything else, so if enemies attack during the move, use the stop movement button to root them in place and put them to work. Set rally point chooses the location where ships built locally will travel to if they have no fleet, and again, I recommend only using the fleet builder, so this is irrelevant, but I'm going to tell you about it anyway. And lastly, toggle scuttle. Scuttling is essentially dismantling, so pressing this button will dismantle everything you built on the planet and give you a partial refund, and I'd only recommend using this option if enemies are about to move in and take the planet anyway, because you might as well get something back before they take it. Bear in mind that all of these options will be there for every single planet, so instead of going through them one by one and building them up, you can also hit the colonize planets button at the top and build them all up from there, including everything mentioned here. Later in the game, this is a great option to progress your empire quickly without having to search for which planets you haven't gotten around to yet. And that is everything there is to know about planets, so we should probably get in some warfare and fleet building. Whilst you can zoom in to look at the action up close and personal in Sins 2, real warfare in-game is normally played on the much more zoomed out level. From here you can order your fleets around, and just like early expansion, we're going to plan out our attack to create a solid battle line rather than leaving room for enemies to flank behind us. Honestly, attacking a hostile empire is basically the same as that early expansion, only now you're likely to meet a lot more resistance. Uninhabited planets normally only have a handful of frigates and maybe the occasional cruiser, but other empires will come at you with a full range from corvettes to capital ships, so you need to be ready for anything. And that is where fleet building comes in. While each faction does have their own selection of ships that do unique jobs, generally, you can follow the following tips. Always have a balance of larger and smaller ships. Whilst those larger ships are for sure the powerhouses of your fleets, they're also normally much better suited to taking on other larger targets with their larger, slower weapons. Bringing some corvettes and frigates into the endgame will ensure you can effectively take on whatever you come up against. Zooming in a little bit closer, you also want to bring different quantities of ships depending on their role. For example, a ship that's strong versus frigates and other crafts, yeah, why not bring a few of those since you're almost always going to be battling those things. However, ships that can only attack planets, you should still bring a few of them, but nowhere near as many since they don't contribute to battling other fleets and will instead focus on planets and be completely defenseless otherwise. You want every fleet to be able to take on almost every enemy, so as long as each has some balance, you should be just fine. You should also be sure to make use of ship items. These can be built in your capital and titan ships, and they vary massively from faction to faction, but generally, they grant bonuses or entirely new abilities to your ships, potentially giving them an edge in battle. Some of these have limited uses, some are just cooldowns, and some are passives. Just hover over each option, and it's fairly self-explanatory what they all do. While I wouldn't worry about this early, later in the game once war is properly underway, items are well worth their cost to keep your more expensive ships fighting at peak performance. You should also be making more than one fleet. Whilst early on you can focus on just the one, once you get to the point of attacking other empires, getting a second fleet on the go will be extremely important. Not only will this allow you to react to any enemy attacks without taking pressure off your own progress, it'll also open you up to attack enemies on all sides and bring in a huge numbers advantage should they turn up with a fleet of their own. Whilst you can send them to the same place occasionally to take down a hard target, keeping all your eggs spread between a few baskets will never be a bad idea. Like I keep saying, use fleet shipbuilding at all times to keep your ships organized and going to the right place. I'd also recommend turning on the move as group option by right-clicking the movement button with a fleet selected. This will ensure your fleets always jump to planets at once instead of the fastest ships going first with the slowest bringing up the rear. This helps minimize casualties and ensure an efficient taking of territory. The only time I'd say to turn this off is if you're retreating, as you just want to get as many ships out as possible without worrying about moving in sync. Once your war machine is up and running and you're taking out hostile planets, make sure you colonize as you go with either a capital ship or following colony frigate. Once under your control, build up their defense as quickly as possible to defend your newly taken territory, and then get them working for you with commerce and mining upgrades. Doing this will make territory harder to take back and start your snowball to being unstoppable. It's simple maths that if you have more resources at your disposal and you make full use of them, you'll be in a better position than your opponents. And now a few final general tips on how to get better at the game if you're still struggling. If you're losing the game or lose completely, take a look at the charts shown post-game. These showcase everything from ships built, total income of all resources, to research completed. Take a look at a few of these charts and see where you fall behind and bear in mind those areas to work on in your next game. There's a lot of stuff to think about at once in this game, so forgetting something every now and then is totally understandable. Just make a mental note of where you fell behind and make a conscious effort to improve this in your next game, and I guarantee you'll keep improving. I'd also suggest using the time controls as you play. Don't let anyone convince you that you're not playing the game right if you want to pause to think about a decision. Some of the research projects in this game are a touch obscure in what they actually do, so taking a few minutes to read through them and pick what to prioritize is totally fine and will only help you improve so you can make snap decisions later. If you want to slow the game down during hectic wars to organize your fleets or to rush defense buildings, then go right ahead. Equally, if you want to speed the game up to get through the slow stats of taking your first few planets, go right ahead. The controls are there for a reason, so make full use of them to your advantage. While there are 3 factions in the game, it can be tempting to want to try each of them out. When you're getting started, I'd suggest sticking with just one until you're feeling comfortable. The faction variants are mostly okay to switch between, as their differences are less game-changing than the totally different factions. Hopping between the factions early on will only further confuse you with more unique mechanics and ways they use resources. Sticking to just one will help you learn how to optimally play that one faction and help you learn the game faster. Once you're feeling confident, by all means, switch it up and learn someone new to find your favorite. Just don't sicken yourself off the game by introducing too many new things early on. And lastly, I would advise you to play from a zoomed out view for as much of the game as possible. Believe me, I know zooming in to see the battle up close and personal looks really cool, and it can be useful to see how the tide of the battle is moving, but it's also limiting your view to a very small part of the map, leaving you open to being attacked on other fronts. By all means, when you meet an enemy fleet, take a quick look to see if it's a fight worth getting into, and then zoom back out to tend to the rest of your empire. The battle will essentially fight itself no matter what you do, so you may as well be progressing your game elsewhere until it's settled. And that's everything you need to know to get started playing Sins of a Solar Empire 2. Let me know any other questions you have down in the comments below and I'll do my best to help you out. Like, subscribe, and if you want more Sins videos, then check out this one all about the Advent Reborn faction.